Hi, everyone, and welcome to our BIPS webinar, Feeling the Mission Hospitals in Persian and British India, with Sara Ebrahimi. Sara is the Humboldt Research Fellow in Art at the Art History Institute at the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at University College Dublin, and also at the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. She's been here with us at the University of Edinburgh in 2019 and 20. She studied for her PhD at University College Dublin, where she was an Irish Research Council doctoral scholar. Her research interests address the multifaceted origins of ideas and practices in the history of international health and architecture, and consider the history of emotions as a way of doing architectural history. So Sara, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, and the floor, literally and figuratively, is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you again. Thank you for the invitation, and also thank you, Sylvia, for facilitating everything. I'm just going to start. How did patients feel when visiting mission hospitals built by British missionaries in Asia and Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? In my book, Emotion, Mission, Architecture, Building Hospitals in Persia and British India, 1865-1914, I'm preoccupied with these questions. But why this question? In 2011, I visited the Morsalin Hospital in Kerman, southern Persia, for the first time. I intended to work on the revitalization plan of a historic hospital, and I was advised to focus on this specific hospital. I was told that the Morsalin Hospital was or is the first contemporary hospital of Kerman. I was born, grew up, and studied architecture in Kerman, yet I was not aware of this hospital, and my advisor failed to mention that it was established and built by British missionaries. On my first visit, the hospital did not appear to me to be British at all, or foreign for that matter. I only learned that the hospital was built by British missionaries after my third visit. Approaching the main entrance of the hospital, which is now closed, I noticed a sign at the top of the entrance, which reads CMS Hospitals. Upon further reading, I realized that the CMS stands for the British Church Missionary Society, which built more than 70 hospitals in Asia and Africa between 1865 and 1939. The first impression that the buildings of the Kerman Hospital left with me did not diminish in time and ultimately informed the direction of my project. I constantly ask myself how patients felt when visiting the hospitals, or to use Sara Ahmed words, how the hospital impressed patients or impressed upon patients. I explore mission hospitals that were built by the Church Missionary Society in Persia and northwestern British India, which is now Pakistan, and argue that they should be viewed as emotional setups that were designed to gain people's trust and affection. In so doing, I offer additional answers to questions of why medical missions developed in a specific way, why the missionaries opted for one region and the city or town over another, why certain architectural forms were privileged over others. While the focus of the book is on the missionary side of the story, it also discusses to some extent how it felt to stay in a mission hospital, showing that we can speculate about local people's experiences by focusing on feelings. It is essential to not make a false equivalence between present configurations of trust and friendship and the stated feelings of historical missionaries situated in different places. It is equally important not to readily translate this term to pacifying or solidifying and assume that the missionaries understood them in a way similar to other colonial actors across time and space. As Rabadis states, there is nothing intrinsic objective or timeless about emotion words. To understand the meaning of these terms in the context of medical mission work, we should consider what changed with the introduction of medical work. Missionaries who were not allowed to preach or failed to reach diverse people through Bible sale or distribution or even opening schools could, by the way of medicine, get closer to a larger and more varied, and this varied, especially important group of local people and visit them at their homes. In other words, these terms imply a change in the sensory relationship between missionaries and local people. They emerged out of a century of mission work marked by frustration and failure to reach a large audience. There were differences in how trust was understood and practiced based on the medical missionaries' gender, national affiliation, and the country they worked in. For example, building trust did not carry the same colonial weight for North American missionaries as it did for British missionaries. Moreover, it was seen as particularly important in what missionaries defined as the Muslim world. With this very short introduction, I'm just now going to focus on the book, and I'm going to specifically talk about chapter 2. I'm not going to go into details because the timing will not allow me to do so, but I'm happy to answer any questions later on. It is not a bit like an English hospital. This was the reaction that the architecture of the CMS hospital for women in Kerman in Isfahan, Persia, elicited from the newly arrived missionaries in the early 20th century. The hospital had inpatients, outpatients, isolation, and private blocks familiar to the missionaries, but the specific design and arrangement of the buildings and the mode of occupation they engender appeared very different. Planned with almost no reference to the prevailing hospital design principles in Britain, the buildings were arranged to form an enclosed compound and were designed to facilitate the free movement between different parts of the hospital. Not only the Isfahan hospital, but also some of the hospitals in northwestern British India were judged in this way. Not all mission hospitals were planned differently from conventional models of the period in Britain. Some were even described as English-like, but they functioned and some were designed to gain the trust of the local communities. I'm going to examine various architectural configurations the CMS medical missionaries developed to obtain trust and friendship. My focus will be mainly on the design characteristics and the plan of the hospitals and the general parts. In so doing, I also challenged the historiography of hospital architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which has been predominantly about the pavilion plan. And for those of you who are not familiar with the pavilion plan, here you can see an example. And what was specifically important was the cross ventilation and the location of bed and windows. Architectural historians such as Jeremy Taylor and Jan Kozowski argue that this type of planning became an international standard by the late 19th century. This historiography has excluded hospitals built in China, along with hospitals constructed in Africa and South America, those built by non-British empires and those by North Americans in the colonized world. Moreover, their focus is mainly on the state and military hospitals. By the turn of the century, medical missions had emerged as one of the main providers of Western biomedical services in colonial territories, if not the only one in some regions. An examination of all these hospitals is required for addressing the extent to which the pavilion plan became an international standard. The CMS missionaries disregarded scientific and sanitary approaches embodied in the pavilion plan to provide a space that could feel familiar. They made and remade prevailing approaches to hospital architecture and invented new hospital designs by disregarding some of the medical concerns of the time. The design of mission hospitals was often left to the care of medical missionaries themselves. They sometimes consulted other missionaries, sought help from military engineers, or brought their ideas back to Britain for professional help. But overall, the archival materials offer relatively little help in understanding how they designed the hospitals. They could have drawn on new and approved design criteria that were disseminated through journals and books. If it was not possible for them to avail themselves of copies of these publications, many of them studied and practiced medicine in pavilion plan hospitals before joining the mission field and could model their design after these hospitals. Additionally, there were missionary examples and publications. The Kashmir Hospital, the first mission hospitals of the CMS, was built on the pavilion plan system, consisting of 7 blocks separated from one another. In 1892, the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among Jews proposed a plan or scheme for a hospital in Jerusalem, drawn by Arthur Resford Pite, an English architect. After his initial design was rejected, Pite proposed a second design, built and completed in 1900. Both schemes were designed according to pavilion principles. As this and the Kashmir Medical Mission were among the first in the Middle East and British India, they could have served as models for other medical missions built in subsequent years, especially as their design was disseminated in missionaries' journals and meetings. Moreover, the plan of a proposed pavilion plan hospital for West Africa was published in Mercy and Truth, a CMS medical magazine, in 1899. However, many mission hospitals built in British India, Persia, and even in Palestine and Egypt did not live up to the principles of the pavilion plan. CMS often opposed episcopal oversights and hence was less disciplined, allowing individual missionaries to follow their stance on architecture. Nevertheless, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which had a cooperative structure and highly regulated the recruitment of its applicants, also constructed hospitals with various layouts. We need to see beyond the organizational structure of individual missionary societies and consider how they were united for the common purpose of gaining trust and affection. Explain their approach to hospital design. In northwestern British India and Persia, the CMS missionaries designed hospitals with diverse layouts. I'm now going to specifically talk about the hospitals that were built in Persia or in Iran. The Isfahan Hospital for Men was completed in 1904. A hospital for women was constructed next to the men's hospital in 1908. Dr. Donald Carr designed the plan of the men's hospital, and Carr and Dr. Emmeline Stewart jointly designed the women's hospital. It is not clear who drew the plan of the men's hospital to scale. Mr. McIntyre, an engineer of the Indo-European Telegraph, drew the plan of the women's hospital to scale. The hospital was designed without reference to the principles of the pavilion plan hospitals. The main inpatient block in both men's and women's hospitals was U-shaped. It was located in the middle of the site, surrounded by all the other buildings, the outpatient block, private block, storage rooms, cooking, and bathrooms. Carr wrote in 1903 that I have every reason to believe that a building on the lines of these plans will provide a hospital which will be suited for work and conditions. One of the main noticeable features of the Kerman Hospital is that, like many courtyard houses in Persia, all the rooms were accessible directly from the outside. And as we can see also in these pictures, how the wards were designed. There were no covered corridors or halls between several blocks, and you must go into the open air, dry and sunny, even in the cold winter, get from ward to ward, wrote Dr. Catherine Ironside in 1915. During the late 19th century, several hospitals in Britain were designed with detached blocks, but in the Isfahan medical mission, almost all the rooms were accessible from outside, even the sanitary facilities. Thus, as Ms. Ebrahimi stated in 1935, one lives practically out of the doors in hospital. Ebrahimi was not talking about open-air treatment, as would have been familiar in a tuberculosis hospitals in the 1930s. Her focus was on how all coming and goings took place through the outside. As far as materials and structure was concerned, the buildings depended predominantly on the regional architecture of Isfahan as well. For instance, the wooden columns and curved flat wooden ceilings of the hospital's veranda copied similar timber structure used in the area since the 17th century. Another more implicit indication paid to the habits of the patients in their daily lives outside the hospital is the similarity between two photographs of the women's ward. The first is of a ward in a Jolfa women's hospital, where the hospital was converted from a house. And the second one is the new purpose-built hospital in Isfahan. The second echoes the first in the rectangular shape, the arrangement of the beds and the windows and the doors. Familiarity seems to have been more important than an up-to-date hospital design. Rather than being merely a place of healing, the hospital had to be an attractive place to spend time. A further aspect of the supposedly welcoming nature of the hospital was that the missionaries permitted the patients to play gramophones or have tea parties in the wards. These mainly happened in the private wards for paying patients. We should distinguish between the sound of gramophones and noises produced by staff. While hospitals in Britain in general are intended to be calm and quiet zones, staff often interrupted the patients with prayers or readings of rules and regulations. Such noises were considered as productive noises. And it was patients who were discouraged from noise-producing activities. The missionaries also prayed at patients' bedsides or preached the gospel, sometimes every day. However, the sound of the gramophones was a noise that patients produced. The private blocks were located some distance from the general wards, and probably the sound of the gramophones could not have been heard in all parts of the hospital. Still, it is significant that the missionaries allowed the patients to play gramophones. It meant the respective patients could listen to a preferable noise. Allowing patients to have tea parties meant creating a familiar smell and taste in the hospital. Private patients could also bring their beddings and necessities to the hospital. Patients like to bring and coat carpets, cushions, curtains, cooking utensils, firewood, and charcoal, transforming the plain, small space into a cozy living room, stated Ms. Ebrahimi. Ebrahimi's use of the word living room clearly alludes to the missionaries' aim. They hope to provide an environment that felt, appeared, smelled, and tasted familiar. The missionaries repeated the layout of the Isfahan hospital inpatient section in the Yazd hospital, where Mr. McIntyre was again employed as the invaluable architect. In contrast to Isfahan, the rooms at the Yazd hospital were vaulted using a method of arching, which McIntyre described as the method of arching in Persia. When the missionaries forwarded the plan and details of the hospital to the CMS Home Committee for approval, Mr. Randall, one of the members of the CMS Committee, criticized the proposed constructive details. Dr. Henry White, who founded the Yazd Hospital, went through Randall's criticisms with McIntyre, and in response voiced his disagreement with Randall's opinion. And I quote, "It is obvious that to those acquainted with buildings in other countries, the Persian method must sound very unsatisfactory. The specification by Mr. McIntyre is in accordance with what is universally adopted in Central Persia." The Persia Medical Sub-Conference backed up White's response and called for no alteration. The missionaries in Mosul also proposed a plan like the Isfahan Hospital, which was never built. It is interesting that here again a different construction method was used, and the facade of the hospital was designed completely differently from the facade of the Isfahan Hospital. It is telling that they used different construction techniques in all these areas, for these areas shared several construction methods, thus developing a model hospital to be utilized whenever required was possible and financially more sound, but the missionaries instead opted for a locally sourced construction technique. And the same again happened in Kerman. The Kerman medical mission was designed entirely differently, from both the Isfahan and Yazd medical missions. The missions also used a local construction technique specific to Kerman. Dr. Dodson and Dr. Winfried Westlake designed the Kerman Hospital buildings. They were constructed between 1914 and 1928. While it was built when the pavilion plan was on decline, the Kerman Hospital was modeled after pavilion plan institutions, at least when we look at the plan. It consists of long one-story pavilions that stood apart amid garden. Each pavilion hosted one ward, and the space between the pavilions was enough for the free circulation of air. Thus, ventilation, however, was not secured in Kerman. The wards were dark. They were designed with 4 opposing doors with a veranda shading them from both the north and south sides. There were no windows, and there is no evidence of a mechanical ventilation system. This was not purely or possibly at all a response to the heat outside. The ceilings were mainly vault using a round vault known as the Kermani, local to the region and found primarily in domestic buildings. This may represent the missionaries' effort to use a locally sourced construction technique and incorporate one that was related closely to the people's daily lives. It is not a method of vaulting suitable for large spans, as was the case in the Kerman Hospital, and I would suggest that this is partly why the wards have so few doors and window openings. It makes the arching roof more stable. Combined, this shows that using the Kermani arch was very important to the extent that the missionaries sacrificed much of the principle of cross ventilation. Like Isfahan, the patients were permitted to make and drink tea and even smoke in the hospital. It remained relevant in the 1910s compromise on the idea of absolute cleanliness. Its importance to obtaining the trust of the people was made explicit in a 1912 article entitled Principles and Practice of Medical Missions. The unknown author of this article emphasized that adopting local conditions had a particular application for the work of a medical mission. There are many points to be considered in the planning of a hospital, where local conditions have to be taken into account, and it is not possible always to reproduce in a mission field exactly the same conditions to which we are accustomed in a hospital at home. This is true in all branches of missionary work to some extent, but it is still more true in the working of a hospital. The author then went on to single out one case. It may be necessary at the outset to conform to the ways of each country, so far as this is consistent with hygienic rules, and even these rules must not always be pressed too rigidly. Integration of local architectural elements and techniques without confining to contemporary hospital design principles distinguishes the medical missionaries' approach to architecture. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, thank you very, very much. It's very interesting. I have one question so far, but it feeds into a question that I myself had, discussing the funding of the hospitals and, I mean, basically who paid for them, but also who took care of the costs for the development of all this. I mean, the working up of the plans and such like this. Were they all Church Missionary Society ventures? And if so, maybe you could say something about the CMS and its funding and such?
So thank you for the question.
Kind of a background, you know, yeah.
Yeah, sure. They had different way of raising money. So one was going around different across Britain or also in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland now, which was part of Britain, and to raise money to have different events or even exhibitions, and also they, for example, produce games for children inside Sunday schools, and in this way they raise money, but also they raise money in the mission field, from different local people. In this case, in this picture that you see here in Kerman, for example, the site of the hospital was, according to what I can know from the materials, that was given to the missionaries for free. And then they also, so this is also thinking about how the hospitals were developed. Part of the reason that this hospital was founded in 1901, and they started to construct the hospital in 1914, and that was part of the reason was that they didn't have the money to build a hospital. They also tried sometimes to build a hospital, but they faced kind of opposition, so they thought they have to wait, and they built a hospital slowly. So they raised money also, for example, in this case in Kerman, and when they left Kerman, I think in 1954, and they sold the hospital to the Ebrahimi household. The people in Kerman wrote a letter that the missionaries actually are not allowed to sell the hospital because we provide all the money. The people in Kerman built the hospital. We gave the site for free. So this is our hospital. This is not their hospital to sell it, but they sold it anyway. So this is I don't know if that responds your question, but there were other ways of raising money.
So there was no British government or, I don't know, East India Company money or anything like that? It was just locals in the UK and Ireland, as you say, and also locals in Iran.
Thinking about the relationship, the CMS relationship with the Church of England, that was complicated, but they also, for example, in northwestern British India, they did have support from different like British administrative staff or even military staff. So they did also help them to raise money. But they thought these hospitals are important because they are bringing people and all these kind of things. So they did also have, like, in a certain way, they were British government in a way involved in funding the hospitals.
And what about the staff in the hospitals? Who were they, foreign or local? Who did the hiring and firing, as it were?
So like the doctors and the nurses were all British. Like in some cases they were from Australia, or they were Irish. Like the person who established the Persian mission was Irish. And also some nurses were from, like they moved from Canada to Britain, and then from there they had training, and then they were sent to the mission field. At the beginning, were all British, but then they also trained local people. So later on, they had specifically nurses. They had nurses that were Iranian, right, or further, like from different parts of them, wherever they worked.
Do you think that the hospital staff, the British hospital staff, were involved in any kind of, I don't know, intelligence gathering or something for the British government? Do you have evidence that they sent reports not just to the CMS, but you know, to any other interested, shall we say, agencies?
If they did directly send, I'm not sure, but I have, like, the last chapter of the book talks about that specifically in relation to the northwestern British India. So they publish a lot of book about that part of the country, especially it was northwestern, like it was the area that some people, like missionaries, had access specifically. Like they say that we can travel, we can gather information that not many people can do. And that is also, like, they use specific words that they are worth regiments to the British government, like these hospitals, because of the way that we can work here and we can travel around, you can visit certain towns or cities, and then they also write in their medical journals, in their private letters, and also in their books. They wrote about these areas, like, in detail. Of course, their writings also, like, problematic when we go through them, how they talk about the people. But yes, they were involved in doing that.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone. Thank you also to Sylvia, our tech assistant, for making sure that the event ran smoothly. And with that, I wish everybody a very good evening wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye now.